Okay, so let's look at what Walter Pater actually wrote. And again, it's very beautiful, but you have to hear the words, and it's tough. Shakespeare's easier because it's set up like poetry and it sounds more like poetry, and it's easier. If you want to get, I mean, I already tried to explain this with the "There is a willow grows aslant a brook" speech that Gertrude gives about Ophelia's death, but this is really, I think Pater is actually maybe the most beautiful writer after Shakespeare. Um, I don't know. I'm just crazy about the guy. So let's talk. So again, I'm going to summarize for you ahead of time. Spoilers. This is what he says. He says, "Can we find anything stable in the outside world?" And then he goes, "No." And he says, "Can we find anything stable in the inside world?" No. And that's the first page. That's the first two paragraphs. Can you find anything stable in the paragraph one? Can you find anything stable in the outside world? No. Number two, can you find anything stable in your soul and yourself? No. Um, Actually, before I read it, let's talk about why that matters. Um, what he's doing is he's living in a century, in a decade, in which a lot of scientific shit is fucking up everybody. So for starters, people really thought that like human beings were like, God put us on Earth for a special purpose, and we're like a special class of being. We're not animals, we're not angels, we're humans. But Darwin came along and was like, no, you're just advanced monkeys. And this upset a lot of people. People also believed in the Bible. In this, because remember, this is England in 1870, 1880, 1890. This is like, the church is a big deal. So they're like, humans are special. And then Darwin shows up and he's like, no, they're not. They're just sort of big brained monkeys. And that kind of knocked people around. They were like, oh shit, everything I knew was wrong. Then people were like, okay, world's about 5,000 years old because that's what the Bible says. And then science geologists are starting to look around and they're like, no, the world is way older than that. And also there are dinosaurs from, hundreds of thousands of years ago. The Bible's wrong. People thought the Bible was written by God or handed down to Moses, and then you have all these philosophers and the historians working in the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s, and they're going, "No, this is not the work of one person. This is the work of hundreds of people over centuries that put the Bible together." So once again, the idea that the Bible doesn't have a single author, human beings are not different than animals. I forgot one. Human beings are not different than animals. The Bible. Oh, right. Human beings are not different than animals. The Bible does not have a single author, and the world is not 5,000 years old like the Bible says it is. People were just like, what the fuck? Is there any stability in the world? Everything is changing. Everything is chaos. This is nuts. And Walter Pater starts out by investigating this. Now I'm going to read Walter Pater. To regard all things and principles of things as inconstant modes or fashions has more and more become the tendency of modern thought, meaning people just feel like there's nothing stable, everything's just changing. So he wants to investigate this. Let us begin with that which is, and I hope you can hear this is a little bit like poetry. Let us begin with that which is without, our physical life. Fix upon it in one of its more exquisite intervals. The moment, for instance, of delicious recoil from the flood of water in a summer heat. What is the whole physical life in that moment but a combination of natural elements to which science gives their names? But those elements, phosphorus and lime and delicate fibers, are not present in the human body alone. We detect them in places most remote from it. Our physical life is a perpetual motion of them. The passage of the blood, the waste and repairing of the lenses of the eye, the modification of the tissues of the brain under every ray of light and sound. Processes which science reduces to simpler and more elementary forms. Like the elements of which we are composed, the action of these forces extends beyond us. It rusts iron and ripens corn. Far out on every side of us, those elements are broadcast, driven in many currents, and birth and gesture and death and the springing of violets from the grave are but a few out of 10,000 resultant combinations. The clear, perpetual outline of face and limb is but an image of ours, under which we group them, a design in a web, the actual threads of which pass out beyond it. This at least of flame like our life has, that it is but the occurrence, renewed from moment to moment, of forces parting sooner or later on their ways. So it's very confusing. But Pater's point is that the physical life, if you like jumping in a lake on a hot day is like a wonderful feeling. But what is it? It's just atoms. It's just, water and air and temperature and sunshine and like what is this? This stuff doesn't have any meaning. It's beautiful and it's happy and it's wonderful, but it doesn't have, without God in it. You know what I mean? It doesn't have significance. It's just like science is just like, yep, these are all things. And your body is made of the same stuff that this. Your body's made of atoms. The sun's made of atoms. Trash is made of atoms. It's all just the same shit. Um, and that's one of the key things he said. That's what he says here. And he says this, at least a flame like our life has, because flame is the element that changes and never stops moving, and our life is like that. It's the concurrence renewed from moment to moment of forces parting sooner or later on their ways. So it's like fire. It's just flickering and moving all the time. It's never stable. It's never still. The outside world there's nothing stable. There's nothing solid. Everything changes. It's just like fire. I think I left something on the stove. I'm going to grab it really quick. I think, speaking of fire, I should go in here and just kind of turn this off real quick. Oh, okay, good. It is off. So that's paragraph 1. And that's it for that. It's lovely. I hope you can hear the kind of the beauty in it. It's kind of extraordinary. This line about, I particularly love this. Like the elements of which we are composed, the action of these forces extends beyond us. It rusts iron and ripens corn. Right? That there's these forces that cause change, that it grows things, but it also destroys them. Far out on every side of us, those elements are broadcast, driven in many currents, and birth, and gesture, and death, and the springing of violets from the grave are but a few out of 10,000 resultant combinations. The idea that, we think birth and death and rebirth are these really important things, and the universe doesn't give a shit. It's just doing its thing, and it's all just part of a process that goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. So he says, there's nothing stable or solid in life. Everything changes, everything moves. It's just atoms floating around. So then he says, okay, is there any stability in human life? Like, what about in here? What about in your soul? So now he talks about people. Or if we begin with the inward world of thought and feeling, the whirlpool is still more rapid, the flame more eager and devouring. So if there's chaos outside of us, there's even more chaos inside of us. There is no longer the gradual darkening of the eye, the gradual fading of color from the wall, movements of the shore side where the water flows down indeed, though in apparent rest, but the race of the midstream, a drift of momentary acts of sight and passion and thought. Right? If you think the outside world changes a lot, your mind changes even faster. At first sight, experience seems to bury us under a flood of external objects, pressing upon us with a sharp and importunate reality, calling us out of ourselves to 1,000 forms of action. But when reflection begins to play on these objects, they are dissipated under its influence. Their cohesive force seems suspended like a trick of magic. Each object is loosed into a group of impressions, color, odor, texture, in the mind of the observer. So reflection is thinking. When you begin to think about, there are all these objects in the outside world. When you think about them, and you think about how they're made of atoms, they all kind of disintegrate. Their cohesive force seems suspended like some trick of magic. Each object is loosed into a group of impressions. So it's like made up of all these different things that kind of disintegrate: color, odor, texture, and it's all happening in the mind of the observer. So it's sort of not real because it's all just, when you experience objects, you're not really experiencing objects. You're just experiencing your thoughts about objects, and you're not really getting anywhere. And if we continue to dwell in thought on this world, not objects in the solidity of which language invests them, but of impressions, unstable, flickering, inconsistent, which burn and are extinguished with our consciousness of them, it contracts still further. The whole scope of observation is dwarfed to the narrow chamber of the individual mind. We feel like things are solid because we give them names, but it's actually just chaotic atoms. And you don't even know if anything's real out there. It's the narrow chamber of the individual mind is the only thing that you can really trust. And even that is flickering and moving and changing, just like the outside world is flickering and moving and changing. The whole point of religion is it's supposed to provide solidity. The world looks like it's changing all the time, but underneath, God's got a plan, and your soul is immortal, and there's important love never dies, and whatever it is. And Walter Payton is looking around, and he's like, yeah, there's nothing solid. I know religious people tell you that God is forever, and that God has a plan, and that your soul will live forever, and that love never dies. But actually, if you look at the outside world, everything changes and moves, so things die. And same thing for your inner world here. Everything changes and moves. All right, cool. See you in the next video.